Our speaker today is Professor David McVey. He is an assistant professor in the Slavic department here at KU. He's originally from Utah, but received his PhD from the Department of Slavic and East European Languages and Cultures at Ohio State. He was just recently telling me that he had spent some time working in Russia with doing interviews with refugees for a while. He teaches classes in Russian language, Russian literature, Russian and East European film, has a research interest in the topic about which he's going to be speaking today, and with a lecture entitled The Clandestine Betrayals of Etacratic Masculinity in Pavel Lungin's Homeland.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay. I'll begin by I'll begin by saying I've worked on Lunguine for several years now, and I'm just kind of happy that he came out with something new and interesting. And it's a 12-part series, and I actually binge-watched it twice. So I've never actually binge-watched a Russian television series before. I usually do that on Netflix, right? But this was so it was interesting, good news. It was a great experience. I was really excited to talk about it. So I'll start off by playing a clip. It is the opening clip from the final episode. Unfortunately, there are not subtitles, and so I've done a quick and dirty translation for you right here. But we'll start off by listening to this opening clip by the protagonist of the series, named Alexei Bragin.
Я Алексей Брагин, офицер российской армии. Я женат, у меня 2 детей. Если вы смотрите эту запись, значит, меня уже нет в живых. Не верьте всему, что вам говорят обо мне, что я не выдержал, сломался, что мне промыли мозги, и я стал предателем и возненавидел свою родину. Это не так. Я люблю свою страну. Мои сегодняшние действия направлены против убийц и лжецов, пробравшихся во власть, против людей, виновных в массовых убийствах и не несущих за это никакой ответственности. Но так было до сегодняшнего дня. То, что я сделал, сделано во благо России, для ее очищения. Иногда, чтобы двигаться вперед, нужно остановиться и посмотреть вокруг, кто идет рядом с тобой. И освободиться от тех, кто ищет от власти лишь личные наживы и тащит страну в пропасть.
With that, we launch into the title sequence of the last episode of the series. Okay. So I must forewarn everyone that there will be spoilers in today's presentation. So if you are interested in watching this, you might want to plug your ears at certain points. So here at the beginning of the final episode of the 2015 Russian television series, Rodina, or Homeland, the year is 1999, and rescued POW Colonel Alexei Bragin, played by Vladimir Mashkov, has just strapped on a suicide vest with the intent of blowing up politicians at a rally on Red Square. As an army officer, popular community figure, and paterfamilias, Bragin is in a position to be admired both in society and on screen. Despite the anomalous dip in public support of the military in the 1990s, given the state's traditional hyper-reverence toward the institution, Bragin's imminent act of treachery seems inconceivable as a plot arc on Russian television in 2015. In fact, Bragin has just been recruited in the series as a symbol of reinvigorated power by the very political party he intends to wipe out, and it's named Отчизна, or Fatherland. If the series title and its basic premise sound familiar to you, it's because they probably are. American cable network Showtime has been airing the popular program Homeland for 5 seasons. The American series was inspired by the Israeli Prisoners of War, which ran for 2 seasons in 2010 and 2012. The Russian series has only aired for 1 season, so we shall have to wait and see how the story unfolds, or whether it will continue to mirror the American version almost plot point for plot point. I have not come across any guarantee of a 2nd season, nor if there will be, whether Lunguine will be directing it. Scandalous screenplays are not uncharacteristic of Lunguine's corpus. In particular, screenplays that challenge prevailing concepts of Russian identity. Indeed, early in his career, the director had been regarded as quite the provocateur. His first two feature films, Taxi Blues and Luna Park, were met with accolades from Western critics and box office success from Russian audiences, yet with derision from many native critics who maligned them as anti-Russian. Then suddenly in 2006, beginning with the release of Russian Orthodox-themed The Island, Lunguine's films fell in greater alignment with acceptable Russian themes and tastes, and I put acceptable in quotation marks. Although it appeared that a series with a clandestine jihadist army colonel would signal a return to Lunguine's earlier Firestarter form, critics were swift to contend the opposite. The consensus seems to be that Lunguine has completely sold out. On a March 2015 roundtable with Lunguine, led by Tikhon Zyetko from the program Hard Day's Night on TV Rain, critic Andrei Arkhangelsky pointed out that whereas the American version was ambiguous or even opprobrious in its regard to government apparatuses, given the current political climate in Russia, it is nearly impossible to criticize institutions on screen or recruit actors to play traitorous roles that might jeopardize their future careers. Most damning, however, is the fact that Channel 1, one of the Kremlin's primary media tentacles, funded the show. On the panel, legendary critic Victor Madison noted Lunguine was in a position from which he would be expected to disseminate slickly produced state propaganda. It is not my intention to rehabilitate the series, which currently holds a dismal composite critical score of 5.1 out of 10 on Kinopoisk. One need not delve too deeply into the snarkier recesses of the Russian internet to encounter reviews that refer to the series as Rodina, or freak show. It is my intention, however, to demonstrate that whether intentionally or not, Lunguine has crafted an important challenge to Russia's Etacratic discourses of gender and national identity, something the director has been doing his entire career. He does so in three ways in Homeland. He undermines the state-venerated figure of the national defender in terms of first, gender, and second, religion, and third, behind the camera, just as Bragin in front of it, Lunguine can be seen to infiltrate the core of a formidable Russian institution in order to disrupt its mechanisms from within. In my talk, I will focus on the first and touch upon the third point. Although critics often scoff at his work, the fact that Homeland broke viewership records on Russian television attests to the reality that Lunguine is finally attuned to what attracts attention in Russia, and his work demands continuing scrutiny. So, Major and later Colonel Bragin is a die-hard Russian military man. He served bravely in Afghanistan and remained on the force after 1991. But in 1993, while conducting an intelligence operation in the Northern Caucasus, Bragin and fellow officer Yuri Khamzin, played by Yevgeny Zelensky, are captured and gruesomely tortured by Chechen rebels. Bragin's captivity punctuates the series in flashbacks. In one harrowing scene, Chechens command Bragin to beat Khamzin to death, an order he ultimately carries out and thinks he's fulfilled. Unexpectedly, a Saudi terrorist ringleader named Ben Jalid, played by Valeriu Andreiuta, who has been recruiting foreign combatants to fight in Chechnya, requisitions Bragin from his sadistic captors. Ben Jalid instructs Bragin to tutor his son Musa, who is later killed in a missile strike ordered by Fatherland Party leader Oleg Basov, played by Andrei Mirzlikin, who seems to be in everything today, but the character whose unethical petroleum-based business deals Ben Jalid threatens to expose. In captivity, Bragin converts to extremely pious Islam and develops loyalty to Ben Jalid. He agrees to carry out a terror attack in Moscow to avenge Musa's death. In 1991, Bragin is liberated and by now a decorated hero. While in captivity, however, his wife Yelena, played by Maria Mironova, begins a romantic relationship with Bragin's brother Dmitry, and his children now regard their doting uncle as a father figure, a dynamic that generates no dearth of tension in the reconstructed Bragin household. The last major plot thread weaves in bipolar FSB agent Anna Zimina, played by Victoria Isakova, who has acquired information that a major international terrorist has recruited a Russian officer. Determined to prove Bragin is the officer in question, she tracks his movements. She tracks his movements. The more she follows him, the more she desires him romantically. Here's Bragin in captivity. And here he is addressing a recent graduated cohort of soldiers in Russia. Okay. And why wouldn't any red-blooded heterosexual Russian woman desire Bragin? He's a marvelous specimen of Russian masculinity. But because he is not top dog, however, he cannot exemplify Raewyn Connell's concept of hegemonic masculinity, which collaborator James Messerschmitt defines as, quote, the form of masculinity in a given historical and society-wide setting that structures and legitimates hierarchical gender relations between men and women, between masculinity and femininity, and among men, end quote. This theoretical frame, however, can hardly accommodate the Russian gender picture in the first place. A number of Russian scholars have postulated more applicable theories. Most convincing, in my view, is Zhanna Chernova's discussion of Etacratic masculinity, which assigns the role of hegemon to the state. Chernova elaborates, quote, in place of the binary model of masculinity/femininity, characteristic of the gender culture of developed industrial societies in the West, where hegemonic masculinity occupied a dominant position in the gender hierarchy, a triangular model was constructed in which the state occupied the dominant position relative to both masculinity and femininity, thus setting and confirming the gender norm, end quote. In other words, rather than operating a system in which femininities and all other masculinities are subjugated to a discursively superlative conceptualization of manhood, the Soviet state subjected everyone to itself, engineering gender roles to fulfill and rewarding compliant subjects. In the Soviet era, as early as the 1920s, the official role for male citizens was clearly delineated. Chernova boils it down further. Quote, the normative exemplar for men was the image of the builder/defender of communism, end quote, further arguing, quote, the readiness and ability to subordinate one's own personal interests to those of society were therefore among the distinguishing features of the Soviet exemplar of normative masculinity, end quote. Men were expected to be fathers as well, but the concept in fatherhood in Soviet terms was limited to breadwinning, the state having usurped legal and moral responsibility for bearing children, even if the idea didn't play out so perfectly in reality. To reiterate, fathers were not expected to be particularly emotionally involved in their children's upbringing. The sole expectation was that they simultaneously build the state and provide materially for their children while defending the homeland. Within the Soviet defender-builder/breadwinner dyad, and I might add on a triad here, the role of defender was paramount. Although the Red Army's victory in World War II continues to be revered as the country's supreme contribution to world history, the veneration of later generations of military men abated little during the Soviet project. Maya Eichler writes that the Soviet Union assigned the military, quote, privileged status in the Soviet welfare state, end quote, and fostered, quote, a deepening societal militarization during Brezhnev's rule between 1964 and 1982, end quote. By the 1990s, though, the military's brand had lost its luster due to a variety of reasons that are familiar to all of us here. The conflict in Afghanistan, a reduction in funding, rampant conscript dodging, the war in Chechnya, and hazing scandals. It bears mentioning that proactive state policies to mint ideal men through military service did not begin with the Soviets. Rebecca Friedman discusses Nicholas I's meticulously regimented cadet corps, which was designed to graduate boys from the gentry into ideal Russian men to represent his administration. One might even consider the folklore figure of the bogatyr, whose duty it was to protect the borders of ancient Rus. The Soviets, however, extended the concept to all male citizens. According to Eichler, quote, the Soviet state pursued a policy of mandatory military service for its male citizens. Military service was a key pillar of Soviet military power, but its significance went well beyond the defense of the country. As a duty of Soviet citizenship, military service was designed to mold young men into patriotic, loyal citizens. The military was also defined as the institution of male socialization, and military service was seen as a rite of passage, end quote. The malaise in military masculinity was seen as part of a greater crisis among Russian men in the 1990s. Oleg Ryabov and Tatyana Ryabova explain that society underwent a collective demasculinization because, quote, the Russian man was incapable in regard not only to his family, but also to his nation. First, there was a significant weakening of the country's international position because of the nation's defeat, in the Cold War, the collapse of the USSR, and the Russian army's defeat in the War of Chechnya in 1994 to 96. Second, human trafficking reminded Russian men that they were unable to care for their nation's women. Moreover, Russian in the 1990s was quite often portrayed not as a mother, but rather as a woman of easy virtue, end quote. Yelena Zdravomyslova and Anna Tyomkina suggest the only venue where respectable masculinity could be performed was in, quote, alternative behavioral practices, such as drinking in groups, sports getaways, and sexual philandering, end quote. And here enter Bragin into Homeland. As it turns out, his captivity coincides with the nadir of the Yeltsin years, this very time that all these scholars have been writing about the crisis of Russian manhood. It is an understatement to insist Bragin's conversion to radical Islam places him in a counterculture. But instead of participating in some marginal men's group, he actually infiltrates the state patriarchy. No wonder the American series title is rendered as Чужой среди своих, or an outsider among one's own kind in Russian. Lunguine instead opts to invoke gendered family associations in his title. Lunguine's choice of Mashkov to play Bragin makes sense. Mashkov is a celluloid legend in Russia by this point and has already collaborated with Lunguine, having played the lead role of Platon Makovsky in 2002's successful Tycoon. In his younger years in the 1990s, Mashkov's looks were actually compared to Antonio Banderas, and he dabbled in American films as well. His popularity emerges unscathed when he plays unsympathetic characters such as Nicholas II, Rasputin, Pugachov from a 2000 adaptation of The Captain's Daughter, and Rogozhin from a 2003 adaptation of The Idiot. He starred in a number of successful television series as well, and is set to front the cast of a remake of the Soviet airplane disaster movie Aircrew next year. Evidently, his popularity has not yet peaked, and Mashkov's cinematic gravitas definitely informs Bragin's desirability. And absolutely everyone desires Bragin for some reason in the film. At the outset of the series, Fabula, Chechen rebels and ultimately supreme terrorist Ben Jalid desire the major for their anti-Russian objectives. As a ranking officer, Bragin is likely in possession of sensitive Russian intelligence, which could aid in rebel efforts. Although Bragin admits to Zimena, the agent of the FSB, to cracking under torture in captivity, he believes he killed Khamzin and converts to fundamentalist Islam under psychological duress, he never divulges any Russian military secrets. It is Basov, the head of the fatherland, who collaborates with terrorists. The rebels' motivation for apprehending Bragin, however, is every bit as optical as it is strategic. Bragin is the quintessence of Etacratic Russian manliness. He is a devout defender of the motherland during a time when much of the population no longer believed in the military. Indeed, Ben Jalid enlists Bragin as a role model for his own son Musa, to teach the latter Russian and serve as a general mentor. As soon as Bragin is freed from captivity, all of his native Russian Federation desires him as well. Most urgently, his biological family feel as if they should immediately facilitate his position of man of the house. As it turns out, assimilating into the nuclear family and registering any sort of tender emotion is Bragin's greatest challenge. His predominant mood is one of emotional indifference toward his wife and children, and he spends most of the movie scowling. His performance is kind of one note. He engages in a litany of alternative and even toxic behaviors. He sequesters himself in the family garage to pray. He vanishes on meandering walks for hours on end. He lashes out with physical violence at other men when misunderstandings arise. He could be one of the sociological anecdotes conveyed by scholars of Russia's so-called crisis of masculinity. In a surreal backlit scene, Bragin places his first telephone call to his wife Yelena, who has just finished having sex with his brother. When she hears Bragin's voice, Yelena's attitude toward Dmitri shifts immediately. She declares to him that she must be faithful to the man she believed had died long ago. Her remorse over the betrayal is highlighted during Bragin's first press conference on the tarmac, as she must submit herself to national scrutiny while he praises her presumed faithfulness in his absence. Although Bragin is clearly experiencing extreme PTSD, on his first night home, Yelena attempts to seduce him, pouring wine and donning a negligee. He responds to her advances aggressively, holding her face down during sex and injuring her arm as he tosses about during nightmares at night. Later, he chooses to sleep on the bedroom floor in a corner. As the series progresses, Yelena makes every effort to accommodate Bragin and allot him time and space to reacclimate. Bragin's children wish to have their biological father back as well. Son Vanya, who is too young to remember his father, wants nothing more than to have Dad chauffeur him to karate practice and the zoo. He desires a father who takes an active interest in his life. Rebellious daughter Katya, who exhibits the greatest skepticism in the family, and here she is in her Metallica shirt, nevertheless takes his side in arguments with Yelena and appeals to him for permission when Mom refuses. Bragin's domestic struggles are well known to Agent Zimina, who has wired his home for surveillance. The FSB desires Bragin as a valuable source of intelligence. Zimina's reconnaissance establishes an unexpected dynamic in the series, however. In the American series, Agent Carrie Matheson, played by Claire Danes, is the protagonist positioned for audience identification. The series opening credits alternate images of Matheson's childhood and news reports that she witnessed in her youth. The sequence extends to viewers a challenge: to fathom how a bipolar, morally compromised woman could simultaneously possess sincere devotion to her country. In the opening credits of Lunguine's series, the camera pans past Zimina as she riffles through newspaper clippings that document Bragin's past. She scatters images of Russia's leaders, interspersed with photographs of Bragin's childhood boxing lessons, deployment to Afghanistan, captivity, and eventual rescue. In the sequence's final photograph, Bragin casts an enigmatic glance at the audience. Instead of inviting viewers to enter Zimina's world to understand what motivates her, Lunguine asks viewers to adopt Zimina's unbalanced point of view as she attempts to understand what animates Bragin. He is the focus of the narrative. Inasmuch as Zimina and a minor assistant and Bragin's family are the only eyes privy to Bragin's struggles with PTSD and his disturbing behavior around Moscow, it can be argued that Lunguine codes the series' gaze as feminine, a radical departure from his earlier work and from classical Western cinema in general. Eventually, Zimina's desire overwhelms her restraint. She pursues Bragin brazenly as a romantic object. He eagerly responds to her advances. Oddly enough, the more Zimina witnesses Bragin's expert deceptions, his secretive activities, his ability to fool a polygraph test, and his cool betrayal of Yelena, the more her passion for him intensifies. True, Zimina seduces Bragin to extract information, but she becomes genuinely obsessed with him and fails to maintain a professional distinction between her objective intelligence work and her subjective feelings. During one weekend getaway, Bragin discovers Zimina's real intentions and terminates the affair. The Fatherland Party is unaware of Bragin's PTSD. What they are aware of, however, is a potentially massive boost in polling numbers should they recruit Bragin as their poster boy. The image Bragin cuts as a stalwart army officer, living proof that Etacratic masculinity is attainable, will redound to their popularity in upcoming elections. The promised payout for compliance with Basov's requests, that is, the rewards the state will bestow on Bragin if he serves as an attractive, successful model of their ideology, is lucrative. And I'll play the conversation between Basov and Bragin.
Казацкие, они как Японские мечи. Опять про якудзу, да?
And we'll start here.
Ну что? Пойдешь ко мне с мной? В смысле? Ко мне в партию. Третьим номером по списку. В декабре будут выборы в Государственную Думу. Я хочу, чтобы мы с тобой выиграли эти выборы. Это твое место. Надо послушать Родине. Что скажешь? Неожиданное предложение. Ну, что неожиданно. Пойдешь и выиграешь эту победу. Станешь депутатом. Скажешь, как только один ты умеешь. Ну, а мы поможем. Ну, что ты испугался? Ты там ничего не боялся. Тут-то что? Надо с семьей посоветоваться. Ну, это правильно. Семьей надо. Вот пойди, посоветуйся, а завтра придешь ко мне и скажешь мне «да». Я буду ждать.
The state, as always, as is evident in this conversation, maintains hegemony in the contract. Bossov, as head of the party and the apex of the state structure, will always call the shots. Who will suffer in the transaction? Bragin's family. Even though Yelena gives her blessing to Bragin's new career path, the family will again be compelled to settle for reduced paternal involvement at home, as Bragin's energies are channeled away from family dinners and zoo excursions in the service of the administration. Here ultimately, Bragin is determined to assassinate the leaders of Fatherland in spectacular fashion. True, he is under orders from Ben Jalid, but Bragin has a dog in the fight as well. He's not a gender reformer per se. Rather, he is on assignment to eradicate the apex of the gender structure that has repressed him and his family, and perhaps all of Russian society. Still, one final significant drive motivates Bragin: the desire to crush the state's hypocrisy of benefiting from its male population's struggle to fulfill the norms it prescribes. Bossov, poised to take control of the Duma, has for years been collaborating with Ben Jalid to vouchsafe the integrity of his oil pipeline network in the Caucasus. Bragin overhears the two men negotiate as he tutors Musa. Bragin decides to exact revenge on state representatives who have cynically and hypocritically capitalized on his long-suffering performance of masculinity, an act which has left him traumatized psychologically and physically, as well as alienated from his family. During the series finale, Bragin undertakes the long-planned terror attack. Khamzin, whom Bragin had presumed dead, has been lying low in Moscow. From the attic of the GUM, Khamzin carries out a sniper attack to instigate chaos. In the melee, Fatherland's brass are instantly whisked to safety, to where else but Lenin's mausoleum. Now that the party elite have congregated in one location, Bragin is poised to eradicate the pinnacle of the state hierarchy, as well as finally dispose of Lenin's embalmed corpse, symbolically rupturing the legacy of enduring Soviet social norms. Bragin slides the vest trigger down his sleeve, primes the device, and readies to detonate. But the vest simply malfunctions. Nothing happens. One might consider this deus ex machina in the plot as a metaphysical Abraham and Isaac moment, where at the last second the deed is called off as compliance has proven loyalty. Loyalty to what, though? I argue it's to Lunguine's track record of offering up alternative protagonists to challenge problematic Russian status quos of gender and identity. The failed explosion permits Bragin to make, perhaps, a more radical gender impact in life than he could have made in death. He will perform the positive paternal role the Soviets sought to suppress, that of an emotionally invested father and husband. While Bragin is in the mausoleum, Katya, spooked by Zimina's accusations that Bragin is a terrorist, calls her father, tearfully begging him to return home. Her pleas are what convince Bragin to abort his mission and abandon his allegiance to the Fatherland Party. In a criminally abbreviated shot, following the party member's exit from the mausoleum, Bragin is left alone to ponder on Lenin's corpse. This shot should have connoted an ultimate rejection of the gender order with which Lenin's project had yoked Russia, but it only lasts for a couple seconds. The subsequent sequence cuts to a close-up cuts in progressively to a close-up of Bragin's still scowling face as he resolutely strolls down the Kremlyovsky Proyezd with an out-of-focus mausoleum and Spasskaya Tower behind him, in symbolic abandonment of Etacratic masculinity. The series' penultimate scene reveals Bragin and his family as they celebrate Vanya's victory at a karate tournament. The final shots exhibits them as they huddle together as a truly reconstituted nuclear family, in defiance of moribund state-mandated prescriptions. Given this interpretation of Homeland, Lunguine's direction must be viewed as a meta-cinematic challenge to state-controlled film and television industries. Lunguine undertakes behind the camera what Bragin accomplishes on screen. He poses as a loyal insider to infiltrate the very system he wishes to defy. By collaborating with Channel 1, Lunguine is working within the structure he wishes to reconfigure. Not only did the early Soviet administration instrumentalize gender for its agenda, it also conscripted cinema to spread its ideology. And as Lenin, whose corpse narrowly escaped detonation in the series, infamously conveyed with regard to Bolsheviks' interest in teaching and reaching people, quote, "Cinema for us is the most important of the arts," end quote. Cinema fascinates and images matter. The reinvigorated Putin administration has not taken these maxims for granted, and in 2008, they launched a state panel on cinema to ensure all films and television be crafted in harmony with the regime's values. Now, however, it isn't only cinema. As film critic Yuri Bogomolov says, builds myths, it is serious television as well. With Homeland, Lunguine performs a furtive end run around current motion picture mandates. As Vadim Elistratov catalogs, the series removes many graphic elements of sex, drugs, and violence from the American version. But Lunguine's nonchalant compliance with the new censorship regime only further masks his ultimate challenge to the system. In a 2008 interview with the website film.ru, Lunguine reflected on artistic freedom at two watershed moments of his career: his controversial debut in 1990 and his 2006 return to Russian themes. In typical cryptic fashion, he mused, quote, sure, of course, freedom has always cut two ways. Cowboy Joe was galloping across the prairie, not because he was uncatchable or because nobody wanted to catch him, but because no one had any damn use for him," end quote. This sounds kind of weird, but this is typical of what Lunguine usually says in interviews. Originally, creative license for Lunguine meant entitlement to cinematic carte blanche to tell your story. He later realized that to continue working, audiences and producers must desire your work. Homeland is a telling example of Lunguine's shift in priorities, given the changing circumstances in which he must function. He still wants to tell controversial stories, and perhaps Lunguine secretly hopes that audiences will desire him more as they, parallel to Zimina's surveillance of Bragin, witness his clever, covert betrayals of Etacratic norms. In conclusion, I contend that Lunguine has not compromised his artistic vision of challenging concepts of Russian identity. As pundits in the United States intoned after the September 11 attacks in New York, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. By extension, one country's traitor is another country's founding father, and one film critic's industry hack is another critic's cinematic saboteur. And that's the end.